I like a moral answer as well. I say, well, look, if it really was the case that having people live longer would cause some kind of resource shortage, then we should try to find a solution that's not deadly. We shouldn't, like, the assumption in this question is that, look, it looks like we're not going to have enough resources, so people should die. And I say this is an incredibly immoral position.
Patrick, the other day I was out walking my dog and I listened to you in another podcast. You were the guest there. And you talked about how life is too short to do all the things we want to do and to accomplish. And also that sometimes you get too sick and debilitated when you're aging. So you can't do the things that you love. And this made me think about football or soccer if you're American. And I used to play football, but I kind of stopped doing it when I was a teenager in my late teens. There was other things that were too enticing, like alcohol, for example. And now I think that if we were to reverse aging, to actually get younger again, I could have another shot at becoming a professional football player. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a great reason for wanting to live longer in good health. It's really a cruel situation we find ourselves in, this human condition, where while we grow in wisdom and knowledge, but we lose our capacity to use that wisdom and knowledge. It's quite horrible. I mean, sport is a good example. You got a Swedish tennis player, Robin Söderling, who just broke into the top 5, and then he gets an illness and he gets a bit depressed about it, and then he loses a couple of years, and then it's too late for him to come back. So he's trained all his life to be in this peak form, and the peak only lasts for such an incredibly short time. But that's, of course, an image for all of our lives, in my view. That is, we build and we build and we build, but then when it's time to actually, start really enjoying life and using all when we have made all the dumb mistakes, and we start making more interesting mistakes, well, then we don't have that much time left, unfortunately. So it's like we are these half-built houses or projects, only half built, and then they just start to kind of crumble. It's really terrible. I feel that it would be much more fair if we grew in youth as we grow in wisdom, rather than the opposite. So that our physical powers should also mature with our wisdom. That would be fantastic, because like hope is such a great value in life too. It's you can stand almost anything if you have hope, but the way that the human predicament plays out, we have less and less hope really to achieve a lot of things, because time is so short and aging is gnawing at our essence.
Yeah, time is short, but we'll take ample time today to discuss aging and death and life, of course, in this episode. But maybe we should introduce ourselves first. So first of all, welcome everyone to the LEVITY podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about longevity. Now, longevity can mean a lot of things. It can mean personal health, the science of aging, health span and lifespan. And these are all topics that we are deeply passionate about. But I think that we're going to place particular focus on lifespan, and what you and me both want is for us to solve aging and to be able to live for an indefinite amount of time. That's also maybe why we chose the word levity, the title Levity for the podcast. Can you explain a little bit why we chose the title Levity?
Well, so levity starts with LEV, and LEV can stand for longevity, escape, velocity, which is a concept I think originating with Aubrey de Grey, who is one of the grandfathers and founders of the modern longevity movement, we could say. So levity then connotes that we want to live so long that we can keep adding on life expectancy more than the time that we live, so that if we can just outrun death, so to speak, by adding more in life expectancy than we consume, so to speak. That's the concept. So if our average or life expectancy increases with more than 1 year in a year that we live, then we can keep outpacing death, and that's Aubrey's plan for us with science, of course. And so we love that concept. We think that's great. And I think a lot about this movement right now, because we do not have a miracle drug. And everyone agrees on that. It's about keeping yourself healthy long enough to get to those more promising drugs in the future that we hope we'll see in the future. So right now it's an incredibly important time for wellness, so to speak, in order to benefit from the more radical life extension that we hope will come with science. Levity also means lightness, and I think we both have, we love the light side of life as well, and taking a humorous point of view also of all of this and everything. I mean, as I argue in my book, the badness of death is a function of the goodness of life. So it's about not worrying too much, but worrying enough to do something about it.
That's perfect. That's beautifully put. And now the people you're looking at or listening to is me, Peter Utschö. It's no use that I try to say my last name in English. It sounds preposterous. But so we'll go with Utschö for now. You have a more easy name for the English-speaking audience.
So I have a quite easy name, Patrick Linden. My full name is Ingemar Patrick Linden, and that's on my book when it came out in the US.
Right.
That my full name. So we got the Ingemar, which is more ethnic. There was a heavyweight champion of the world, Ingemar Johansson, for those who are old enough to remember or follow boxing. So I guess that name is not completely unfamiliar. There's also a filmmaker, of course. Slightly different
Which
spelling.
Ingmar are you? Are you the boxer or the director?
I did judo when I was young, so I got that. And I do like boxing and martial arts in general.
Yeah. So we'll introduce you, Patrick, shortly, as this very first episode of the Levity podcast will focus heavily on your work. But just to say a little bit about me, I'm a science and tech journalist. And I also wrote a book about longevity that's called Evigt ung, min och människans dröm om odödligheten, which translates to Forever Young, my and humanity's dream of immortality. And you'll get to know me a little bit better in the next episode. But all of this discussion, Patrick, around longevity and radical lifespan extension and even immortality invites a deeper exploration of what it means to be human and how we should think about life and death. And it's all very philosophical in nature. And that is why I'm so happy that I'm doing this podcast with you. Because not only are you a philosopher, you've also written a book where you argue that life is good and death is bad. And the book was first released in English, titled The Case Against Death, and it was recently published in a Swedish version. Yeah, there we have it, The Case Against Death. And why did you start in English and not in your native tongue?
Well, I lived in the US for, 20 years about, and I did my PhD there in philosophy. I wrote about moral theory, about what ultimately makes moral statements true, if that's possible, that they are true, right?
Is that possible?
That's a very, very long story
Okay.
for another podcast. I
Right,
mean,
right.
I do think that we must presume that they are true. I mean, because we do want to have a rational debate about what's worth pursuing and what's worth avoiding, what's good and what's bad. And after I finished my PhD, I was teaching at NYU, Tandon School of Engineering, at the humanities department there. So I did a lot of classes that had to do with ethics and technology and bioethics. I taught bioethics for pre-meds. And then I also let's say, energized my interest in the topic of death. And I was actually there's a term today, triggered. I was triggered to write this book because I found that so many people really seem to be incredibly complacent about death. They say, well, everything that lives must die. It's not a big deal. I hope I die before I'm 80 because it would be boring to continue. And aging is interesting and fun. I would hate to be young, they say, because, then it would be to be stuck in a certain state, and that would also be boring. So, and so on, and many other arguments. And I thought these are terrible arguments. I mean, obviously, it's better to be youthful and alive than to be old and perhaps decrepit and or dead. I mean, obviously, it's such an obvious thesis, but it's not an obvious thesis when you talk to people, and that's reflected also in surveys that's been made on this issue. So that's a long story to explain why it's in English. It's in English because I started drafting it in the US, in New York. I sent it around to different publishers, and I was lucky to get MIT to be interested in it. And they say, well, that's an interesting idea. Can you give us a full draft of the book? And so 2 years and more, I worked on that, and then I wrote an email and said, do you remember this? This is that book that you wanted to see the full draft of. And I sent it in, and then after a lot of work back and forth, it came out 2022. And that's the story, and that's why it's in English.
Right. If we go back even further, maybe we'll start with your childhood, and you can talk a little bit about how you realized, how you awoke to what death means, and how that has kind of shaped you.
Yeah, so like many children, there comes a point when they are between 5 and 7 when they realize death. Maybe they see a dead animal, and then their parents say, okay, this is the reality of this, or they tell a story about it that makes sense of it. Right? So for me, I realized this, and I realize also that I have a lot of dreams and I have very little time. But I didn't let go of that feeling. But it wasn't just that. It was also a sadness. I saw my grandparents that I was pretty close to, and I thought to myself, I remember my grandfather was teaching me how to fold a plane, paper. What do you call it? Paper plane? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, oh my God, one day he's not going to be around to do things like this with me, and it was just really, really sad. And I had a religious background. My grandfather was evangelical minister, and so I was thinking about the continuation, but then I was never persuaded by continuation. I mean, it would be wonderful if there was a continuation and we could just kind of it's a transition, like you finish high school, and that's kind of sad, but then you can still go on, so I still today think that the idea of heaven is just exactly the right imaginary response you should have. I'm just unfortunately I'm not persuaded that it's a correct metaphysics, right? I don't have a belief that I will continue. So well, and then this is something that never really left me, and I studied philosophy, and the first paper I think I wrote was on time, the what time is, um, and then it went on from there until I was provoked to write the case against death, because I recognized that what I thought everybody believed, namely that it's better to be youthful and alive than the opposite, it seems like almost a minority position. Isn't that your experience as well?
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting with your book because and of course this is something that a lot of us that are convinced that life is good and death is bad is true. But it's interesting that in a way, when you say that life is good and death is bad, almost everyone would agree with you. But there is kind of like this temporal thing that they would agree with you up to a point, and then they don't agree with you anymore. Then they say things like, "Yeah, we'll get into what people say," but
Yeah.
why do you think that is?
Yeah, there's definitely an ambivalence here, because on the one hand, people will, wear seatbelts, and they are afraid of bears when they walk in the forest, and they get out of the way of speeding trains and so on, and when they are at the hospital and they're suffering from some serious illness, they are pulling out all stops just to continue life a few more weeks or a few more days, even, right? So that seems to suggest that they do agree with me. On the other hand, if you have a conversation with people, they will say that they're not afraid of dying and they don't want to live forever. And then they add some type of argument that they say, well, it would be boring, or they would be alone because everyone they know would die around them, and so on. Or maybe they have a moral reason. They say, I don't want to stand in the way of future generations. So what my thesis is that there is an ideology at work here. So on the one hand, people have a natural instinct of survival. People
Yeah,
instinctively and primitively know that it's not a good thing to die. But then they have all kinds of ideas and phrases and feelings that are shaped culturally that makes them say these things and think these things that somehow tames death or makes death more. They talk about, this is the term literally used, embracing death. I'm sure you heard that.
yeah, many times.
Yeah, which is just I mean, that's the last thing I want to embrace is death. I want to embrace my girlfriend or my wife and my kids or friends. I don't want to embrace death. I mean, that's terrible. So it's really, I mean, that someone once said, well, is this about like the id and the superego almost, like, so the id is kind of the less culturally refined driver, is kind of knows that it has a will to life, and then you have like the superego who invents all these ways of intellectualizing a situation, saying, look, death isn't so bad, it would be much worse without death, and so on and so on.
You actually have
Yeah,
a term or a name for this. You call it
yeah,
the wise view. And you argue that the wise view is false. Could you
Yeah.
explain to us what the wise view is?
Yeah, so the wise view is my name for this ideology of death acceptance. And it also has another name that is apologism. So apologism is in thanatology, the study of ideas about death, is the view that death is something that is not bad and that we should not try to prolong our lives. And that's the standard view among the philosophers and the wise people of the past. And it still is today. So if you read something in the press, for example, or hear someone talk about death that is a kind of public person, they will definitely write something in the vein of the wise view, namely that, look, these Silicon Valley people are trying to extend life. That's terrible for one reason or another. Lately I actually come to think of it as a kind of high status view as well. It's like you are seeing yourself as more wise than the people who are afraid of death. So it's the vulgar are afraid of death, and here comes the wise person and says, look, don't be so afraid of death because of these reasons. And then they give part of this ideology, the wise view, they give some kind of justification for death, some kind of apology for death. So, I mean, this project of coming up with reasons for accepting death is core to philosophy, all the way back to as long as you want, all the way back to Socrates, if we talk in the Western tradition, right? He certainly wasn't afraid of dying, if you remember, right?
Yeah.
He said,
He
I
took
feel,
it. He took
yeah,
it. He took
yeah.
it in stride, you might
He,
say.
yeah, more than that, right? He said, I feel sorry for you who have to stay here. You know, he says, a philosopher has always been striving to die because he wants to liberate himself from his body. He wants to live just in the ideas.
Yeah, we're going to return to
Yeah.
the ancient philosophers in a little while. I think that just before we die, there's the aging part.
Yeah.
And maybe we should just start there with
Yeah.
the aging, because you write quite a lot about that in your book as well, and you make a difference between aging and getting old, right?
Yeah. And another way of putting that is the difference between chronological aging and biological aging. So I am very much in favor of chronological aging, namely living a long time. That's a good thing. But biological aging, that's the process that make you more likely to die by in various ways causing damage to your physical system, to your cells, and so on. That then leads to frailties, that then leads to a vulnerability to various mortal diseases, kills you in the end. So I see aging, biological aging, as a terrible thing, a real curse, a tragedy for humans. But chronological aging is the goal to increase. So get rid of biological aging and increase chronological aging.
Some say that we should be able to age healthily, but that's not
Yeah,
possible in my view. That if you have a biological system that is functioning optimally at, say, like 25 years of age, and then afterwards it's not functioning optimally anymore, then
yeah.
it's not healthy, right?
No, I mean, Jose Cordero, who wrote the book The Death of Death, he once said, talking about healthy aging is like talking about healthy cancer.
Yeah, exactly. We all want the healthy version of cancer.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at, and I spend a whole page just describing the symptoms, because there's a way that people talk very loosely about aging, as if it had nothing to do with all the deleterious changes in us. But aging really just is the sum of all the deleterious changes in us. None of
Right.
the changes of aging are physically for the better. They're all for the worse. So to say that aging is an acceptable, a good thing, that is to say that something that is very, very deleterious to us is a good thing. It's almost absurd, but it's very common. And that to say that I want a healthy deterioration is a contradiction in terms.
Even still, there are people in a certain age, say maybe they're 50 or 60 or 70, but they say that they feel really good about getting older, and they're calmer, they're happier, and so on. But you argue that it's not because they have aged, at least not biologically aged, but in spite of it.
Exactly. It's because they have gained in chronological age and experience that comes with that. We learn as we live, and we get better at handling situations. A certain form of intelligence increases. That is, we can see pattern, we can recognize things, and our emotional intelligence can increase. But all of this is despite all the deleterious physical effects. If instead we could have all the experience that makes us wiser and calmer, plus not having to worry about all the diseases and all the damages, that would be ideal. That would be good. So I think I completely agree, and people do misunderstand this. I completely agree that it's great to be 70 or 80. It's fantastic, but it would be even better if you had the vitality of your body as a 25-year-old. If you have that health, that robustness, that would be better. I mean, I say another thing. I say that, you know, if you think there is some positive effect of being somewhat physically not in your prime anymore, it's not worth the risk.
Yeah, as you said, you spend almost one page just listing the various things that happens to us as we age. It's quite powerful to read that, actually. And in Sweden, I'm sure there are a lot of other countries as well. Not all countries, though. But in Sweden, we try to a little bit sweep it under the rug. We have elder care and retirement homes, so that we all don't have to see the aging take place, right? But you've actually worked
Yeah.
for a period of time in a retirement home. What was your experience of that?
Yeah, so when I was quite young, early 20s, I worked for a while in the Swedish elderly care. And I met a lot of lovely old people, but I also saw that they were incredibly damaged by aging. And so I saw a lot of misery and loneliness, and I was struck by the images of the people who I gave care to, pictures of them when they were young hanging on the wall, and they are beautiful and full of life, and now maybe they need help with going to the bathroom, or you know, taking all the tablets and all that, and you know, I saw really, really terrible things. And so I sometimes I get upset with people being so complacent about aging. It really is perhaps humanity's greatest problem, but it's not even seen as a problem. So that which has happened to these poor people that I was taking care of, that's all good and fine. But it's not all good and fine. It's terrible that this happens to a person because of the aging.
You have a powerful way of reframing this. It's a thought experiment which you have called Syndrome X. Can you explain what Syndrome X is? I think everyone knows what Syndrome
Yeah.
X is, but they
Yeah.
don't think of it in that way, right?
No, exactly. It's a thought experiment where you say, okay, let's imagine that we didn't have aging. So we would die from other causes, but we didn't have aging. And we didn't know what aging was. Then all of a sudden, some people got a syndrome. And in the syndrome, around 40, 50, their joint starts to hurt. The teeth gets worse. The hair is falling out. After 50 or 60, they start getting cancers and die from it. They get diabetes. They get cardiovascular diseases and so on. And looking at them, they look incredibly frail and sick. Their bones are brittle. They don't skateboard anymore. They don't do things like that. They have to take it very, very easy. They have to wear extra sweaters so they don't get cold and so on. That syndrome X seems like one of the worst thing that could happen in terms of a virus or an illness. But of course, that's aging. I'm describing aging. So if someone said that X, that's actually not such a bad thing.
Yeah.
That's absurd. Of course, it's we just habituated to it, and you can get habituated to living under dictatorship, and you say, well, it is what it is, right? And you don't even think that much about it. And you can get habituated to unfreedoms then in many ways. And of course, this is an unfreedom, but we're so used to it that it's just something that we don't see. So part of what I'm trying to do is to, as they put it, problematize aging.
Yeah. There's a lot of beautiful passages in your book. I recommend really everyone reading it. It's wonderfully written. And just to close this out, our discussion about aging, and we've touched on this before during our discussion here, but you write that we're on a cruel path when we gain knowledge of how to live as we lose our ability to live. Yeah, that's just one phrase of your book, but it's really, your book is full of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and okay, so after aging there comes death, and now we'll talk about the central argument of your book, and that is why death is bad. And as we've alluded to a little bit earlier, we all agree that death is bad, but only under certain conditions. So we're more likely to say that death is bad if someone young dies from cancer, or if it happens to a child, or under certain conditions, we all agree that death is bad. But if it happens to someone who is, say, maybe 90, then it's natural. I mean, you have lived to a certain age, and 90 is quite far as it is right now. And then it's natural to die. But you argue that death is bad no matter how many years has passed since someone was born. And maybe that it's even worse if you have lived longer, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm suggesting that you can think that way. You can definitely say that both someone who's young and someone who's old is losing the time where they could have been alive. And then, of course, many think that, well, but the young person could have been alive longer than the old person, so they lose more potential life in the closest possible world, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, well, that's true, of course. But in the same time, if you look at it theoretically, you could say, well, yeah, but I mean, they're still losing all that time when they could have been alive instead. Their future, whenever you lose your life, you lose all of your future, so to speak, whether you're young or old. But in addition, the old person, the person who's 90, is also losing everything they built up during their life. And that's never taken into account. It's so strange because people talk about enriching experiences. So if they have those, they should be enriched. Something in them should increase in richness, right?
Right.
In value from that perspective. And in that case, well, they lose more if they have been more enriched, so to speak. But it's not only that; they also more perhaps they have more relationships. They have deeper roots and relationships to other people when they're older. Of course, a lot of that has been taken away by other people around them dying. But that's also tragedies. That's also terrible circumstances.
Mm.
But theoretically, it's hard to say that necessarily a young person's death is that much a whole category much worse than someone old who dies. That's just it's a common view, but it's not that well supported. I mean, but regardless of that, today we have a situation where the death of a 90-year-old person is not seen as something really bad at all, not a tragedy at all. So I asked my students that I taught a course called Death, Longevity, and Values. I asked them, do you think that it would be a bad thing for somebody who is 90 years old and has had a good life to die? Do you think that would be bad? And almost no student thought it was that bad.
Do you think it was because they thought that the 90-year-old was sick?
I think perhaps subconsciously, of course, I made it clear that this was a 90-year-old who could expect, if they didn't die, they could have a good life instead. So,
okay.
But I think it's difficult for people to imagine someone who's 90 and not very sick, or someone who's plus. If they're young, it's hard for them to imagine people who are above 80 and not very sick. It's very hard for them to separate like the biological and the chronological part of aging.
Right.
That is, so, I mean, I asked them to think, how long would you like to live in good health? That is chronologically. But it's as if they cannot imagine that if they lived longer than 100, they would be fit, right? Even though I stipulate this.
Yeah. It's we've increased life expectancy quite a bit, and people are generally living a lot longer now, but we haven't really touched the ceiling on lifespan. So it's still hard for people to imagine that a 90-year-old wouldn't look at least very old. Maybe their health hasn't deteriorated that much yet, but still it's hard for us to imagine that as it is right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is shown in studies when you ask these kind of questions that the more you try to spell out the fact that it is possible to stay youthful longer and so on under this scenario, the more interested people become in this. But it's very hard for them to shake this idea that you can be both long living and healthy at the same time. It's a very difficult concept. Isn't that your experience as well?
Yeah, exactly, and that's why we're doing this podcast. And I think there's a lot of momentum now to actually try to change that view. But yeah, for now we're going to try to teach people new ways of thinking about life and death, and you're certainly a very good a teacher in that regard. So, talking about death, now, one of the most commonly held beliefs is that death cannot be bad because when we're alive, we are per definition not dead, right? We're living, we're not dead. So it cannot be bad in that regard. And when we are dead, we do not exist anymore. So death cannot hurt us. And it's more like an eternal dreamless sleep. And this is a core tenet of the wise view that we talked about a little bit earlier. And you trace this wise view all the way back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus.
Yeah.
Who was Epicurus, and why are his ideas still popular?
Well, so Epicurus was active in ancient Greece after the time of Plato and Aristotle, and he was famous for having a kind of early materialist view of the world. So everything was composed of atoms and void, and when we die, it's just the atoms dispersing, and the old Democritus, who came up with this atomic theory, he compared it to the atoms to like the letters in an alphabet. So just like the letters in an alphabet compose words, the atoms compose objects. It's a very,
Right.
very nice image.
Yeah.
And so really, Epicurus says, when you die, the letters are still there. They're just scrambled in a different way, right? So nothing really goes out of existence, really. In that sense, of course, you do, but it can't hurt you, he says, because when it happens, you're no longer there. There's no one there to be hurt. And so either you're alive and death has not harmed you, or you're not, and death cannot harm you. So death is harmless.
Right.
And of course, I mean, you hear this in Sweden. Sweden's a very secular country. And so if one of the go-to things people will say is that, well, they're not afraid of death because, when you're dead, you're dead. And that's all there is to it. You're not going to suffer when you're dead. You're not even going to know that you're dead. There's no one there to be harmed, right? So, yeah, it's if you come at the world with a naturalist kind of materialist picture, then this really is your wise view. This is very central to your wise view.
And this
yeah,
has been
yeah,
this has been like going on now for millennia.
yeah.
It's like you say, the Greek philosopher meets Swedish secularism in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. The arguments are very, very similar over thousands of years, definitely. And as I say, this argument is really tricky. It's not that easy to refute.
Yeah, but I mean, you do your very best to refute it in your book, and it's like you put on your detective hat for a while there and go searching for ways of disproving this notion that death cannot hurt us, either when we're alive or when we're dead.
Yeah.
And you start out with something really interesting that you call the deprivation theory, and you also mentioned something called an alternative cost. What is deprivation theory, and what is alternative cost?
Yeah, so if you want to make an argument for why you think death is bad, apart from your intuition, which I think in itself is somewhat of an argument, that you have a kind of direct apprehension of the harm of death. You understand it with your being, so to speak, kind of instinctual understanding. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's nothing. I think that's something. But if you want to give a kind of propositional argument, philosophical argument, for why death is bad. You could say, well, death is bad for those who go to hell. But if you also want to stick with a one world metaphysics, you say this is this is death as being annihilation, where you are made into nothing, and it's permanent. How then do you explain the badness of death? Well, the answer to Epicurus, who says, and all those who say, look, death cannot harm you because you are not when you're dead, is that, yeah, but I'm missing out on a lot. And that is the deprivation view. So the badness of death consists in all those things that death deprives you of. Seeing your family, playing your favorite sport, having a glass of wine, having a talk like this on a podcast, just taking a walk in the park, and so on. Everything you value, right, seem to require minimally that you exist, right? And so the way I put it is, I frame it as the economist would, as an opportunity cost. So it's not necessarily that it's so bad to be dead, right? We have to say, well, it's like nothing. So all through the book, I am supposing a one world metaphysics, right? That this life is all there is. I'm not doing it because I don't think it's possible that there could be more, but I'm doing it to limit my discussion, right? So in some sense, you could say my thesis is that death is bad for you if death is the end, if death means annihilation, right? Then it's bad. So the standard view to respond, the standard way to respond to that particular element of the wise view is to say, look, it's not that it's so bad to be dead. It's about all those things I can't do when I'm dead, when I'm busy being dead, so to speak. It's the opportunity cost. And I think it's the right answer. And that's why I say, the badness of death is a function of the goodness of life.
You give an example in the book with the sleeping man.
Yeah.
When you talk about the alternative cost or opportunity cost, can you?
Yeah, that's very good, because like they say, well, when you're dead, it can't be bad for you because you're not suffering. But you can take an example of the sleeping man. The sleeping man has a wonderful nap. It's a fantastic nap. But he misses his own wedding to a woman he loves a great deal. So the nap was terrible. In fact, it was catastrophic. Right. The nap was catastrophic. He was just going to maybe lay down to refresh himself a bit for the big day, and then he just misses the whole thing. Well, that's right. So it wasn't.
Must have been really tired.
Yeah, he was really tired
to miss his own wedding.
Yeah, but he did, right? So it wasn't that it was so bad intrinsically for him to nap. In fact, it was an enjoyable nap. He wasn't suffering in the nap. There wasn't anything there that was unpleasant. It catastrophic compared to what he could have been doing.
Right.
And so that's similar to how death harms us. It's the alternative cost.
But as I've said, you put on your detective hat, so you're not completely satisfied with the deprivation theory. I mean, you say that you think it's the right argument, but you still go looking for more clues, and that's when you have to ask yourself the question: who is being deprived? The person alive or the dead person? And this is where you go into such things as presentism and eternalism, right?
It gets very hairy, and I'm giving. I could have.
Yeah, but this is the nitty gritty of
exactly.
it all.
Exactly. So I'm giving myself a hard time there, and it took months actually to write that section.
I can imagine.
Really, because it's quite frustrating, because yes, the deprivation account is, I think, correct. But there is this problem with the missing victim that is explaining exactly when someone is harmed by their death. Who is harmed when? That is, put a date and a kind of geographic location for exactly when the bad happens. Well, then we get back to this conundrum that, well, it's not when someone is alive, it seems like, and it's not when they're dead, right? Because when they're dead, they're dead. So it's like, when exactly is someone harmed by their death? Not when they're dead, because they can't be harmed, right? And not when they're alive, because they're still not dead. So there are various ways then of trying to explain how this is possible. So I call it the kind of victimless crime argument, that it's very hard to locate this the subject of the tragedy, so to speak. And so one way is to do this through a theory of time, when you say, look, common sense says that the only thing that's real is what happens in the now. But Einsteinian physics would say, look, that's an illusion. Really, the past, and the present and the now really are all real. And it's a matter of perspective from where you look at it. If I died, let's say, it's hard to use me as an example because I'm sitting here all alive. But I talk about a poet, Philip Larkin, and his death. I ask, when was his death bad for him? So one answer is to say, well, it was bad for Philip Larkin, who exists in the past still. It's bad for him that he died. So you have a subject, and you can point to the subject. It's a subject in the past who it was bad for that he died. And that really solves it.
Why did you choose Philip Larkin, by the way? You mentioned this in your book.
Yeah, because he wrote a fantastic poem about death, about waking up at 4 a.m. and realizing that he's going to die and everything is going to go away. And he also writes, it's absolutely no comfort to him that he's not going to feel anything. He says, in fact, that's the whole problem. I'm not going to be around to feel anything. And I think that's just exactly right. So you can say, well, look, here's my Einsteinian physics and the view about time, that everything exists, and that the past, the now, and the future really just kind of all exist in this kind of four-dimensional way. Fine. I mean, it seems to solve it. And the funny thing is, the interesting thing is that Einstein actually used this in a letter to the wife of a friend of his who died. He said, well, we educated people. We know that time is an illusion anyway, right? And so don't worry.
That's really powerful. That letter he wrote.
Yeah. So he still exists, just not in this illusion we call the now, right?
Yeah,
he's still real.
So just to be clear, I mentioned presentism and eternalism. I think maybe the viewers or listeners can deduce. But of course, the presentism is the idea that what exists is only the now, and eternalism is what you're talking about when discussing this idea of Einstein and others, that the past and the present and the future is kind of coexisting.
Yeah, exactly, and that things that exist always exist.
Right.
And it's so interesting when I found this, that Einstein is actually using his theory of time in the condolence letter, basically saying that his friend and her husband is still just not right,
Right,
there.
right.
Just not right there. Now, so that is an answer, and maybe that's the right answer. But I don't feel entirely comfortable because it's a very sophisticated and hard to grasp metaphysics, and I think that death is bad. It's a very simple, almost childishly simple thesis, and I don't think it should rest on a very, very complicated and perhaps questionable thesis. Yeah.
Yeah, so you go forward in your
Yeah.
search,
Yeah.
and you arrive at the American philosopher Thomas Nagel,
Yeah.
and he says that the goods and ills of a person cannot always be exactly located in a sequence of places and times. Oh, now you have to
Yeah.
untangle that for us.
Yeah, so I had the great fortune of having Thomas Nagel as one of my teachers in New York. Unfortunately, we didn't talk that much about death, but I always, he's one of my favorite philosophers, and he shares my view on death, I believe. So yeah, he points to a very interesting phenomenon, namely that there are certain goods and bads that we can't always locate perfectly in time, and that the badness of death is an example of this. And he gives a great analogy here, and he talks about a man who suffers, let's say, a stroke that turns him into a being with the intellectual capacity of a small child. Now, this small child has all his needs met and is quite satisfied. Now, did something tragic happen? Yes. Where's the victim? Well, where's the victim? I mean, the man is reduced to that child, and that child is doing fine. Still, this is very, very tragic. Right? And so it's similar to death then. And, it would be ridiculous to say that just because we can't say exactly when somebody harmed by a debilitating stroke turn them into, a vegetable-like or toddler-like being, that isn't a tragedy for the man, even though we can't say exactly when it's a tragedy for the man. So, in philosophy, in other contexts, sometimes it's about what you're prepared to give up in an argument. And I don't think we should be prepared to give up that it's a tragedy and it's something bad for someone to suffer a debilitating stroke that turn them into reduce them to the level of a small child. So yeah.
Yeah.
Did that strike you as a good argument?
I was kind of satisfied when you arrived at the deprivation theory.
Yeah.
So I was surprised when you took it further. Oh, he's not satisfied with the answer.
Yeah,
I'm quite satisfied, but still,
yeah.
I think it's very important that you really take this to its conclusion, and we have to say that even though, well, again, you think that now you've kind of come very close to your answer, but you still say in the book that you're not completely satisfied, and you write that where death is, we're not, and that is a problem since it deprives us of all that we value about being alive. The only way to care less about death is to care less about life.
Exactly.
So we turn to life now, right?
Exactly. Very good. Very good. Yes, exactly. So in some sense, I continue the argument by pointing to what does it mean for a human being to take the view that death is harmless, death can't harm them. And I say, well, only if you are disinterested in life can you have that position. Because if you really care about something in life, then what you care about gives you a reason to live, and therefore a reason to not want to die. and therefore death is a threat. So that completes my argument. And I criticize very much certain schools of wisdom that say that the root of your fear is that you're attached to certain things in life. And then they say, so don't attach yourself. And I say,
this is some of the most funny parts in passages in your book.
Yeah.
When you point out that contradiction.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And I say, well, but I think it's a terrible ideal to have of somebody that they should not care about life, about their different ambitions and so on. That's terrible. Just in order for them not to fear death, so to speak. So, in some sense, the wise view, and in particular this kind of version, Epicurean version, certain interpretation of Buddhism, and so on, they achieve their resilience to fear of death by denying a lot of what makes a life worth living. So it's a too high of a price. I mean, I have an example of a man who desires to see his wife and his children that he hasn't seen, and he's on his way to meet them, right? And then Lucretius writes about that if he dies instead, it's not a big deal, because when he dies, his desire to see them dies with him. So it's quite amazing. So you're supposed to be impartial between seeing them and have your desire fulfilled, or losing your desire by dying. It should be just, if I live, I'm happy to see you, but if I die, that's just as well, because I'm not going to miss you.
They're
if I'm dead.
They're equally
good. Because if you say they're not equally good, if you say no, my wish to see my wife gives me a reason to live, well, then you have a reason to fear death again.
Yeah.
Right? So to death or to proof you against fear of death, you have to, in some sense, get rid of your love of life, or any reason you have to stay alive. And that's just, for me, that's too high of a price.
Some people they search for the meaning of life, and they find no meaning, and some people even take that to its extreme and say that since there's no meaning, it would have been better if they hadn't been born at all. And they also point to, not only is there no meaning in life, but there's also a lot of suffering, and not just the kinds of big suffering, or in search for a better word, but also the small suffering, the everyday suffering, as completely valid reasons for not to exist at all. And what is your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a classic phrase, that better never to have been, and it's a book by David Benatar, a contemporary philosopher. Yeah, I think that's terrible. I think it's ungrateful to the parents too, who spend so many resources and so much time raising you, and then you come up with your philosophy, which says it's better if I never had been. It's. I think.
You think that's a little bit ungrateful?
I think it's incredibly. I think it's incredibly ungrateful. I mean, they say that it's morally wrong to have children, to inflict life on them, as they put it. And here I find myself standing with the kind of Christian doctrine of the sanctity of life, or the value of life, and the life as a miracle. That's how you should talk about life, I think. And it's just like, wow, what a waste for these people to live if that's how they think. I mean, I think they're making a mistake. I don't think they are. I don't think all of them are entirely serious. I mean, Epicurus talks about people like that, because this is, as I said, it's an old view. And he says, well, if they were serious, they wouldn't be around to speak that truth.
Right. And also, I guess, even if we don't find meaning, and by that I mean, like, if you search for some answer to what this is all about, that's maybe not something that's needed, right? For life to be good and meaningful.
Look, the meaning of meaning in this context is very vague. Usually, it's very hard, because on the one hand, meaning, purpose, and so on, our life cannot but have that. I mean, as long as you engage in any kind of activity with a goal, that's a meaningful activity, right? So often it's thought of, well, it's like, we mean here, by meaning, we mean there's no like final objective for everyone that needs to be pursued, or something objective and given. But you're absolutely right. I say, okay, even if there isn't anything objectively given that we have to aim all our actions and a whole life towards, it can still be incredibly good to live. We don't need that kind of objective meaning, I think. And here I am with Sartre. So Sartre famously said that life is meaningless. But of course, he also says that we make commitments in life and we find meaning, we create meaning. He says, in our life, we have the opportunity to show what a meaningful human life can be. But it can never be judged by reference to an externally given meaning, an objective meaning. So it's full of subjective meaning, and each life is an opportunity to show what a human life can aim at and be.
Mm.
But it can't be measured by something given outside. That's one answer. And so here you say, well, there is no objective meaning, but life can still be amazing. And if you're an existentialist, you say it makes life more amazing because it gives you the opportunity to show what a meaningful life can be, right?
Yeah.
But there are other answers. You can say, well, no, God exists, or something external, and has a certain plan, and perhaps meaning is to find out this plan and live accordingly, right? And that's a view that's very common. And then there's other views say, well, no, a real hard naturalist would say, oh, the meaning is to have children and live a natural life, and the meaning is given by the fact that we have a certain nature, and that's meaningful. So we can live a meaningless life that is a bit objective, because we can live against nature, right? So but of course, right, no one has the final proof of what kind of meaning there is and there isn't. And I say, we don't need that. We don't need that answer in order to know that it's bad to die and that it's great to live, as long as certain conditions are met. So I think the meaning issue is
meaningless.
Meaningless. Yeah. Yeah. It's not as, let's say, it's not as determinant at all for the value of life. I think like the value of life can be unaffected by what theory you have about what meaning is and what meaning there is.
Maybe a more powerful argument, or maybe powerful is the wrong word, but it seems to me that it's more common, at least, is that aging and death is a natural part of life. To which you respond that it is tempting to think that when natural is used in moral arguments, it means nothing more than that we are accustomed to something, and we are used to aging and death, and therefore we see them as natural and somehow beyond criticism. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's one of the most common arguments is that aging and death, they are good because they are natural. And it's a very, very questionable argument, right? Because we know of a lot of things that are natural and they're terrible, right? Cancer is natural, but it's terrible. the cure is artificial, then it's wonderful. So it doesn't really usually function so well. Now, another problem here is that the appeal to nature seems to be very selective. So in some cases, people are okay with things that are unnatural. They use the internet, but all of a sudden, when it comes to staying healthier longer by fighting aging, they can't do that because it's unnatural. So it's just very selectively used as an argument, and that's why it seems like, look, we're used to the internet now. We're used to cars. We're used to electric light, but we're not quite used to this anti-aging science. So it's unnatural. And if you go back in history, right, the institution of slavery was natural. I mean, that was one of the arguments for why it should be kept. But really, what does that mean? Now we can see it meant that this is what they're used to. That's the institution that they operate inside, that accepts slavery, and that therefore they see it as natural. Right. So it's really not a particularly good argument. So an appeal to nature usually isn't a very good argument, but I think that in some cases, an appeal to nature can still offer some kind of support for a position. So I'd like to say that the fear of death and the wish to live, the will to live, are natural. And I would say that our intellectualizations about how it's not bad for us to die are artificial. But I think there is something quite natural for a human being to see themselves extending much, much longer than a natural lifespan. I mean, and that's, of course, why we have all these stories of people living so much longer, right? It's not hard for us to see that we should not just be like any other objects that wear out and go away. There's something terrible lost when a human dies, I believe. I mean, I believe we all universes in ourselves that are unique and irreplaceable.
You write in your book that you think that technology actually is more in tune with humanity than maybe what we think of as natural or from nature. Can you explain what you mean? It's a really powerful argument that it's actually better with this artificial synthetic society where we use technology to better our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one hand, we are these mammals, right? And we have mammal needs, right? Basic animal needs, right? But we want to say that there's something that distinguishes us from other mammals, right? And so it's our rationality. Philosophers usually say, it's our, we have a certain kind of largeness of spirits, you could say as well. It's, or our soul, right? You could say, right? There's something that makes us different. And so when we can live more in accordance with our reason and our imagination, our spirit, and so on, it seems like we're living in a world that's more attuned to who we are. So in some sense, the more artificial world is the more natural for us, because we are these, that what distinguishes us is that we are these beings that can create such a world, and that no other animal can, right?
There's another old argument that's being made that we need to die because there needs to be some kind of turnover or recycling of life, that old organisms must make way for new life. Is this a valid argument, do you think?
Well, Lucretius makes that before year 0. And at that time, there only lived a few 100 million people on Earth. right? And he wasn't the first at all making that argument. So it's this kind of Malthusian argument that there's only so many resources, and so if people don't die, will be too many, and catastrophe will ensue. So yeah, I think it's a terrible argument, because it seems to be underestimating foremost our capacity to increase our resources by increasing our technology.
This overpopulation argument is one of the most common myths that people who are in favor of radical life extension is faced with. I mean, I've been out giving lectures and talks about my book, and I think that in most cases, I'd probably say 8 out of 10 cases, the first thing that people asks me directly afterwards in the Q&A is, but what about overpopulation? And why is it a myth, Patrick?
I mean, there's so many ways of approaching an answer to that, but first of all, population growth does not happen so far because people live longer, but because people have more children. That's what's driving population growth. And this is why you see today, in the longest living societies, you have a population decrease. So in my book, I speak about Japan. So Japan is one of the longest living countries, and they're about to lose perhaps half their population during this century because they're not having enough children, right, to sustain the population. So it seems like up to a point, population growth is about how many children we have, fertility, and not about mortality when we die. So the whole argument is just getting off on the wrong foot to start with. Now, as a matter of fact, more than half of the Earth's population live in countries that are either stable or more often decreasing in population, despite us having gained 30 years in average life expectancy the last century, right? So how do you square this? You see, longer living seems to mean slower growth, not more rapid growth. In fact, the countries where you see growth are the countries that have the lowest life expectancy. So countries like Nigeria, and Afghanistan are growing quickly, and they have the youngest population, and they have the lowest life expectancy. So there isn't this straight correlation that people imagine. So it's just simply gets off on the wrong foot from the beginning. That's one empirical answer, right? I like a moral answer as well. I say, well, look, if it really was the case that having people live longer would cause some kind of resource shortage, then we should try to find a solution that's not deadly. We shouldn't, the assumption in this question is that, look, it looks like we're not going to have enough resources, so people should die. And I say this is an incredibly immoral position, especially since the argument is that, look, we have this possible resource shortage, so old people should die. That it's picking out the group to die in order to solve what I think is a problem that has many solutions apart from preventing old people from living longer. That is death. I think death is the absolute worst instrument here, the absolute most immoral instrument, to look at people as if, look, we're not going to have enough oil, we're not going to have clean water, so now people need to die. No, we need better technology, I say, for starters, or we need to make do better with the resources that we have. Two ways to operate here. There are many ways to operate here, but it's absurd to say, well, look, we might have these problems, so it's better that old people just die.
Yeah, and this if we agree that it is immoral, then it's not only something. It's not a thought experiment. I mean, this permeates society right now. We actually show this in our actions, or rather, the actions that we don't take. That we have more than 100,000 people die every day of aging, age-related diseases, and when we're saying that we're afraid of overpopulation and let somehow that dictate our actions, then we're just slowing down the development of actually solving the problem.
Yeah, I mean, to add on the empirical point, the UN is calculating that we will plateau at the end of this century, and then be stable and perhaps even shrink, and we will be about 10 billion people. And then people say, well, that's like 2 billion, more. And so, yeah, but look, don't you think that technology will become, 20% more effective over the next 100 years? I mean, it's as if they think too that our resources are the way they are, and technology is not going to change, and and then it's going to be a problem. But of course, everything changes. Right? It's really as if they don't want there to be any other solution than that all people must die.
Yeah, there's even some bioethicists that think that we should actually actively not give drugs or help people above a certain age, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they think that a good life can be had, by the time you're 65, and then it's about focusing on a good death. That's literally their language, right? The good death. How do you die a good death? They say they're not interested in this, prolongation of life. It's not natural, etc. It's quite outrageous, I think, and it's just again, it undervalues the individual life. It's horrific. I mean,
Yeah.
I have examples in my book, of course. This, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote about this. What would happen if we had an older world? And he says, the problem is that old people won't get out of the way. Come on, what? I mean, as I said, it's so interesting that you can talk about, this group, the older people, in this way, that they should just die. I mean, the thing is that there's a Norwegian, Jarle Breivik, who I have this Twitter feud with sometimes, right? Who holds these views. He was tweeting out, recommending an article that I didn't read the whole thing, but it sounded like that you could say that the role of a grandmother is to die.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, no, and
but it's interesting, because if we were to try to pick any other group of people and use that language, it would be very problematic, to say the least. Right?
Yeah.
Here's the group of people, and we've selected them for dying.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about overpopulation here, but when we talk about, how old people are hindering progress, and that's why they should die. I mean, like Elon Musk literally holds that view, surprisingly.
Yeah.
It's just no one really, I do, but no one really calls him out on how immoral it is, As I said, look, there are a lot of quite productive people in their 80s and 90s. Why not save them and just focus on all unproductive people in society and have them die? I mean, wouldn't that be more efficient then? I mean, if that's the plan, if the plan is that people who are standing in the way of progress should die, well, why not be more selective then? I mean, it's just to show how horrendous it is as a moral premise.
Yeah, that's and it's ageism that's so prevailing in society that we often even don't think about it. There are a few more objections about radical life extension and the idea that we should solve aging and abolish death. And one of them is that, Patrick, you're actually very greedy and egoistic if you want to prolong life, right?
Yeah.
That's one argument that you've heard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So my first response is that I think it's quite reasonable to want to continue to live. And it's recognized by the UN that everyone has a right to life. So I don't think it's particularly greedy. I think, yes, it's in my interest to live. I want to live. I have a right to live.
You actually have the right to live.
Yeah.
Isn't that fantastic?
Literally, right? Because of the UN. But I mean, yeah. And you know, we recognize in law that you have even the right to kill someone if they're trying to take your life away.
Mm.
So, wow, you never say that was incredibly, you know, greedy and selfish of you to defend yourself from someone trying to take your life. Of course it wasn't. We recognize that. People have a right to life. The will to life is not greed.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, but even if you're not greedy,
Yeah.
and egoistic, and you claim that the UN says that you have the right to live,
Yeah.
wouldn't you be extremely bored? I mean, living like 150 years, or God forbid, 1,000 years. I mean, what will you do with all that time, right?
Yeah. I mean,
I'm being ironic now because this is one of the another arguments that's being made.
Yeah. I mean, exactly the good old boredom argument. What can you say? I think that it built on misperception. They do not think that the world is inexhaustibly interesting, but it is. They're making a mistake. And rather than thinking that dying should cure them from this mistake, I think enlightenment about how interesting the world is should cure them from this mistake.
I think it's maybe so. It's easy to have an answer on that, and it's as long as you still have your curiosity, then that's all that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and my answer is like, if that's how you feel, then you should work on your feelings. Because you are not
go to yeah. You need therapy, not dying.
You need enlightenment, not death. Exactly.
Right.
It's just a mistake if you think that the world has nothing more to offer you after you just lived for 80 years or so. It has much more. I mean, people, they limit their expectations to what's possible in this scenario, and they say, well, you know, I've done these things, A, B, C, D, education, marriage, career, etc. Now I'm done. Can I please check out? That view, I call it in the book the kind of shopping list mentality or shopping list view of the world, looking at it as a kind of finite project that has certain goals that you need to hit. But I have a different way of looking at life here. I see it more as a process that is open-ended and continuing. We're building something, we're improving something all the time, and there's no particular end to it, as I see it necessarily. So another image is the typical like triangle, the stairs of life, where you go up, you're 50 on the top, and then you kind of go down, and then you check out. And I prefer to see it as kind of this open highway image of life. You know, wow, where to go next, right?
Patrick, right as of right now, there is no way of postponing death, at least not in the way we're talking about, the indefinite lifespan, the risk of dying not increasing just as time goes by, right? But if we're lucky enough, there might be in our lifetimes. What do you think that you would spend your time on if you had a lot of more years left to live?
I mean, you pointed to it before when you said curiosity. I'd like to know some things. I like to be educated, bildad. What do you call that? Bildung, the German. It's like being like profoundly cultured and kind of enjoy the best, the essence and the best that humanity has been able to produce. And I know very little of that. And then there's like these whole worlds. I don't know Spanish. There's a whole treasure there. This can go on for forever, but I mean, just as an example, you talked about soccer. You'd like to, what if you go back on the field, have a youthful body, but your adult, mature mind? And yeah, I work on my tennis, and I have to say, it literally saddens me sometimes how bad I still am at tennis. And also, it wouldn't sadden me if I knew that physically there is no limit to how good I can get, because then I would have hope. But I have no hope.
But that's what we're going to change. We're going to talk a lot about in this upcoming episodes about, for example, the idea of biostasis. That's cryopreservation, where you actually is put on pause, so to speak, and in the hope that you can be revived in the future when science has advanced, and hopefully we don't need that solution, but it might be an alternative. We will also talk about, for example, replacement theory, where you could actually try to replace your body, and even progressive replacement of your brain. So what makes you will still be intact, but the brain will be rejuvenated, so to speak. So these are both very interesting topics to really explore, and so I think that it's of course sad to think about death and how we're becoming more frail as time goes on. But what I really want our listeners and viewers to take with them is that we're also full of hope for the future. And I think that maybe the wise view is doomed. Patrick, what do you think? Do you think that the wise view has a future?
I think that the more credible and plausible the longevity science becomes, the less attractive the wise view will be.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. We're going to do this together, but today you were the guest and I was the host, and I think we'll do it the other way around in our next episode. And then we'll actually get to host these episodes together, and we'll have a lot of fantastic, passionate, very intelligent guests with us that are ready to talk about radical lifespan extension and everything related to that. And but first, before we close out this episode today, I just want to encourage everyone to buy a copy of Patrick's book, or buy two, that's so that you can give it to someone you like, or someone that's convinced that death is a good thing, maybe they can be enlightened. And your book, as we've said, it's in English, and it's called The Case Against Death, and it's also available in Swedish, and there it's called Mot döden, en radikalt livsbejakande filosofi, which you could translate to The Case Against Death, but the subtitle is A Radical Life-Affirming Philosophy, which is nice, I think. And Patrick, if people want to know more about you and maybe connect with you, even, where can they find you on social media and so?
Yeah, they can find me at Dr. Patrick Linden on Twitter. I have a homepage,
or X as they call it nowadays.
On X, and I'm there every week at least, and post things. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, Patrick Linden, and you can also find my homepage, ingemarpatricklinden.com. Those are some places. Thank you, Peter. I mean, this is the beginning of a very interesting journey of learning and discovery, really, and a real open highway.
It's wonderful. This is the Levity podcast with Patrick Linden and me, Peter Utsjö. And thank you all for watching or listening. Hope you all enjoyed it.